intro and sort of here. Great, thank you, Sydney. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining. I have lost track of how many of these updates we've done so far, but you have joined the Circular Action Alliance quarterly stakeholder update. We've done them a bit more frequently recently based on more comprehensive updates and news that we have to share with you, but we continue to think that it's really important to give all of those who are interested in what's happening across the states that have extended producer responsibility laws for packaging visibility into our work and a chance to ask us questions. I want to thank everyone for your engagement with us to date, not just attending these sessions, but we've gotten a ton of outreach. We've been invited to present to a number of groups, and we've had many interesting one-on-one conversations. So while this is a great and efficient way to get sort of a lot of information and the latest and the greatest on what CAA is up to in one place, if you have more detailed or specific questions for us and things that we don't get to today, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach us at info@circularaction.org. That information will show up on a slide at the end, and I'll just ask my colleague Sydney to put it in the chat as well. My name, I should have started with my intro, is Olivia Barker, and I support all of Circular Action Alliance's work to engage with a variety of stakeholder groups. I'm leading, with the support from my colleague John, who's on the call today, our efforts to educate and prepare producers, companies that are going to have obligations under new packaging extended responsibility laws for those obligations, and we'll talk more about what that looks like on this call, and also many of our external communications efforts. So in previous meetings, we've had other members of our team. We will continue join these sessions. We'll continue to have folks from the program planning team join when appropriate and when there are more detailed updates today. But for today, you've got me and John giving you a bit of a rundown on where things are in all of these states. So maybe can we go to the next slide, please, Mark? Great. I'm just going to read this because I'm not an attorney and I'm too nervous to summarize it. But I just want to reiterate that the information provided in this presentation does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. CAA is not an attorney nor law firm and does not provide legal advice or recommendations. Information in this presentation is not a substitute for the advice of an attorney. No reader should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information in this presentation without first seeking legal advice from your attorney. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this presentation are hereby expressly disclaimed. Next slide, please, now that we've got that fun stuff out of the way. All right, so just a few housekeeping reminders. I mentioned this at the beginning. We do record the webinar. We stop the recording at Q&A. We will be able to provide both a copy of the recording and slides to those who have registered after the presentation. We have also been putting these recordings on our new YouTube page and making those accessible through our Circular Action Alliance website as well. We will be using the Q&A and not the chat function for questions today. Feel free to put in questions as they occur to you. We are going to try and reserve at least 20 minutes for questions at the end. We won't be pausing in between sections just to make sure we can get through all the updates. But we will then be reading through as many questions as we can get to and providing answers. Again, if we're not able to get to your question, feel free to reach out to us, and we're going to do our best to sort of summarize key themes where there are multiple questions on the same topic. We have not restricted access to this presentation to anyone. There may be media in attendance. We do just want to underscore that this is a session designed for stakeholders and not media necessarily. And so if you have media inquiries, please hold those. Do not ask those in the Q&A. You're welcome to reach out to us for a comment at media@circularaction.org. That email address is wrong. It's my apologies. And then you've got the email address for us generally, as I've mentioned a couple times. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Great, so here's our agenda for today. As I said, we've done quite a few of these updates since the organization was officially incorporated and kicked off at the end of 2022. We don't want to patronize anyone, but we do appreciate that there are stakeholders who come into this conversation late or are just learning about CAA or maybe just learning about EPR. While this is not going to be a 101 presentation, it is really intended to be an update. We're going to start with just a few key slides grounding us in what EPR is, who CAA is, and what brought us to the point of being able to share these updates with you today. I will say that, again, those previous stakeholder webinar recordings are accessible again on our website, on YouTube. The earliest recordings will have a lot more detail on who we are and what EPR is. And then some of the more recent ones for this year cover topics like what were our key milestones in progress in 2023, what was the outlook for 2024, what were some of the core components of the Oregon program plan, which we're also going to touch on today. And then we did have a special stakeholder session explaining the findings of the Colorado needs assessment, which my colleague John will also just touch on when he gives the update related to Colorado. So lots of good content there for anyone who's got time to go down the CAA and EPR rabbit hole. We're gonna then go into some state updates. This is where we'll be able to provide more information on what has happened since we last spoke to you and where each of the states are in the implementation process. And then we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on producer registration and preparedness. Circular Action Alliance is a producer compliance organization as a producer responsibility organization, which we'll describe to you for those who may be new to EPR and pros, what that is in just a moment. But our focus is one of our top priorities is ensuring that companies that will have obligations under new packaging EPR laws are following along or aware of the timelines and deadlines and ready for reporting and all the steps that come after that. And then, as I said, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. Next slide, please. Great. This is us. You've seen me. I've introduced myself. I'm going to let John introduce himself when he takes us through the state updates. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, great. So again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this today, but I think it's always helpful to remind everyone of why we're here. And again, there may be folks who are newer to the topic, but extended producer responsibility is a policy approach that makes the entity that puts a product into the market, and in this case, that product is packaging, responsible for the costs and management of that product or packaging at the end of life. So the US passed its first EPR laws for paper and packaging in 2021, but there are examples of other EPR laws, also known as stewardship programs, for products like electronics, paint, mattresses, prescription drugs, sharps, batteries, that predated these packaging EPR laws. So producer responsibility is not a totally new concept in the US. Extended producer responsibility for packaging is not a new globally. There are many countries that are a bit farther ahead of the US in implementing their packaging EPR laws, specifically the European countries and the Canadian provinces. But we are rapidly approaching the date where the US's first packaging EPR laws are about to go live, or programs are about to go live. And so we always start with the disclaimer that while the US laws are oriented around that same principle of shifting the cost of recycling from municipalities and consumers to companies who are known as producers, there are some differences between the state laws in terms of how much of that cost shifts. If producers are paying for just system improvements on top of what is already being done to manage recyclable material, or if they are paying for all recycling systems cost. There's also variation in what materials are covered and even who is defined as a producer or the company that is obligated for paying to have the packaging that is covered under these laws managed in recycling programs. Again, that producer definition is something we spend a lot of time talking about. I'm sure it'll come up today. There's still some ambiguity in the definitions from state to state, and we're seeking to address that through our comments on rules where possible. But typically, the EPR laws that we're talking about here in the US require brand owners or manufacturers to either partially or fully fund the collection, sortation, and processing of the packaging they use for the products they put in the market. In some cases, this responsibility falls to a licensee of a brand. And in the case where there's no producer or manufacturer licensee, it is then the first importer of the packaging into the US that becomes responsible. And again, there is some variation here. The legislative intent of these laws, as I'd mentioned, there's cost shifting that happens here. It really is, in many cases, to defray the cost of recycling and then optimally improve recycling through system improvements. But there's also, these laws are also intended to incentivize design changes. So there are requirements in the laws that the fees that are charged do just that, and encourage producers to improve the recyclability or minimize the waste associated with the packaging that they're putting into the market. And then the big question is, how are producers going to manage their responsibilities under these complicated and different laws? Um, and that's where the producer responsibility comes in, and that's who CAA is. So under most US EPR laws, a pro is a nonprofit producer-led organization. Producers have an obligation to form and join such an organization to comply with EPR in the US. And that is really what led the companies that started up CAA, who we're going to just give you visibility into in just a moment here. That recognition of that obligation, as well as a desire to build a compliance organization with an efficient and cost-effective structure, is what motivated our founding members to take early action and form this organization in 2022. And then the role of the pro and CAA in the states where we've been approved is to manage the financial and, in some cases, the operational requirements of EPR laws on behalf of the whole producer community. So this includes registering producers, developing and implementing program plans for managing those materials, and invoicing producers for the costs of associated with implementing those program plans. The pro has to work with the entire packaging and recycling value chain to meet the requirements of these laws, which again vary state to state. But I think, you know, this is one of the reasons why we've been really keen to have these conversations and have had deeper conversations in each of the states that has EPR laws on the books, just to make sure that we are understanding, you know, where there are opportunities and gaps in the system and how we can collaborate to ensure that these laws are driving towards the intended environmental outcomes. I will say, just, and this will come up again, you know, ultimately most producers will need to register with Circular Action Alliance. Circular Action Alliance will be the single PRO, at least for the foreseeable future. And if we can go to the next slide, that will talk a little bit about sort of where we're active, where we've been approved, and where we're going to focus our conversation today. So again, Circular Action Alliance is a new nonprofit producer responsibility organization, or PRO, that was formally founded in 2022 by a group of companies who are on this slide. And that was in response to the passage of EPR laws in California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. Those are the 4 states that have laws that require the establishment of EPR programs, although there are other states that have other requirements related to EPR, and specifically related to studying the potential for EPR in a given state and making recommendations on what a future program might look like. I will just say, as I always do, we are very grateful for the leadership of this group of 20 companies. But I do want to underscore that the organization's intent is to represent and provide services to all producers who have obligations under these new EPR laws. Again, this is, you know, most states only approve a single producer responsibility organization, at least at the beginning of the program. And it looks like that will be CAA. It will be CAA in California and Colorado. We've been officially approved there. And it looks like CAA will be the only PRO in Oregon, at least for the foreseeable future, even though that is a state that did allow for multiple PROs at the beginning. And that's just based our assessment that we will be a pro in Oregon is based on the fact that we are the only organization that has submitted a program plan, the approval of which is a requirement for officially becoming a PRO. We have not yet been approved in Maine. I will just note that that approval process is farther out. We are certainly engaged in the regulatory process in Maine. And then the other place where we are sort of playing an official role is in Maryland, where one of those study bills that I've mentioned has been passed, and that has established a needs assessment process and an advisory council on which Circular Action Alliance holds the single seat for a producer responsibility organization. So that is an opportunity for us to represent producers in discussions about what a program, an EPR, a future packaging EPR program in Maryland could look like. Next slide, please. Great. Just very quickly, because I want to get to the state updates. Um, for those who are a bit newer to CAA, we formed with the primary objective of creating a more consistent and harmonized experience for producers, very few of whom have responsibilities in a single EPR jurisdiction. And I think the structure we have here is a national services organization where that is supporting state level organizations to provide consistency across states where possible, particularly through the delivery of certain compliance services. So, one IT reporting portal as an example. But I think there's in addition to helping producers achieve these kinds of efficiencies from a compliance and program cost standpoint, this is also an organization that is committed to enhancing recycling systems and strengthening infrastructure to reduce waste and ensure that more material stays in the circular economy. And we believe that this structure gives us the ability to scale best practices, to take learnings from one state and apply them to another, while also recognizing that there are different requirements for each individual state, and states have different kinds of recycling infrastructure and needs. So this is an organization that, where possible, we're going to do our best to achieve some economies of scale, and again, not limit best practices and innovation to a state, but there will be solutions that need to be created bespoke for specific states. And we are staffing the organization and setting up a structure that allows us to do that and to have a very strong local presence in each of these states. So I think I will pause there and turn it over to my colleague John, who can touch on the updates from state to state.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Olivia. Mark, if we can go to the next slide. So the next little section, we're going to do a state-by-state update here and cover over some of the processes across the states from a high level. There's a lot of, as we dive deep into the weeds, there's often a lot of questions asking to sort of come back up to a 30,000-foot view and look across the states and remind folks about what is happening in each state and where we're at in the process. So we're going to cover that off first, and then we'll go into those state-by-state updates. I should say, before we dive in, we're going to be giving state updates today from the three Western states, Colorado, California, and Oregon. As Olivia said, CAA is approved as the single pro in Colorado and California. And we were the only pro to submit a program plan in Oregon, and we expect that that program plan to be approved, and therefore, by extension, have CAA approved as the single pro in Oregon later on in 2024. We aren't going to be giving an update from Maine. That's not to say that we aren't engaged in Maine. We were engaged in Maine's rulemaking process over the past couple of months, but a lot of the critical, timely updates from CAA pertain to the three Western states. So with that, Mark, if we could go to the next slide. Again, this is our high-level overview of the processes in each state. In particular, I want to call out the difference between needs assessments and program plans. There's lots of terminology here, and this is a way of sort of breaking out and helping clarify the different steps in the processes. Before I dive in, a needs assessment, again, is essentially a gap assessment that either a state agency directly or through a contract, or a pro directly or through a contract, undertakes within a state to understand the current capacity of the recycling system and any gaps that need to be filled by the EPR program. As Olivia was sharing, a key role of the producer responsibility organization in order to provide producers with compliance is the development of a program plan. And that program plan then addresses all of the different gaps and needs that are outlined within the needs assessment as required by the particular state statute. So that's just hopefully a helpful clarification on some of these terms before we dive in. Starting on the left with Colorado, CAA was selected to be the single pro in Colorado in May of last year. So that was the first state that CAA was approved in. That was the first major step in Colorado's process, was selecting a pro. The next major undertaking was the development of a needs assessment in Colorado in order to understand the current capacity of the system, again, where those gaps are in Colorado's recycling infrastructure and recycling programs. That was conducted through a subcontractor to CAA between August of last year and January of this year. That needs assessment then was submitted to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE, at the end of January of this year. The next step in the process was for CDPHE to select a preferred recycling scenario coming out of that needs assessment that was then brought to the Joint Budget Committee in the legislature for consideration for approval. On April 17th, the Joint Budget Committee did approve the scenario selected by CDPHE, and that selected scenario that outlines a projected recycling rate given a particular amount of investment in Colorado's recycling system will form the backbone for CAA's program plan that will be submitted by February 1st of next year. In the meantime, CDPHE has kicked off their rulemaking process that began end of last year into January, and then will finalize or be finalized in early June. The state has a rulemaking hearing on May 21st, so just next week, and then promulgation of those rules will come soon after. Once CAA's program plan is submitted to CDPHE on February 1st of next year, we'll go into a program plan approval process that will run from February of next year through the end of 2025, and that program is set to start by January 1st of 2026. If we turn to California, the first major step in California wasn't actually the selection of a pro. The first major step was the kickoff of Cal Recycle's informal rulemaking process. That ran from January of last year through December of last year. CAA was involved in those stakeholder workshops, providing comments and insights to Cal Recycle throughout the process. As that informal rulemaking was being undertaken, Cal Recycle did run their pro selection process that began in September of last year and culminated with the selection of CAA as the single pro for California on January 8th of this year. Just before CAA was selected as the pro in California, Cal Recycle kicked off their formal rulemaking process that has been ongoing since late December of last year. We just closed out on May 8th the formal comment period for Cal Recycle's formal rulemaking process, and we expect those rules to be promulgated sometime before January of 2025. At the same time that the formal rulemaking is being undertaken in California, Cal Recycle is conducting their needs assessment in California. Unlike Colorado, the state is managing the needs assessment process in California. They will be working through a number of subcontractors. They're currently releasing RFPs for their 5 study areas that make up their total needs assessment. That work kicked off in January, and we expect the results from those needs assessment studies to all be complete by late in 2025. Once those needs assessment studies are complete, they will feed into the ongoing development process of CAA's program plan for California that must be submitted to Cal Recycle by April 1st of 2026. That will then kick off a program plan approval process that will run from April through the end of 2026, and the program plan needs to be approved by January 1st of 2027, which is the start date of that program. Lastly, flipping over to Oregon, similar to California, Oregon did not begin with selecting a pro. Oregon began with their rulemaking process. They've actually broken their rulemaking process into 2 sections. So phase 1 kicked off in the summer of 2022 and culminated in promulgated phase 1 rules in November of 2023. Their second rulemaking process is currently underway, kicked off last summer, and will wrap up with promulgation of the phase 2 rules in November of 2024. Oregon has not had as comprehensive of a full needs assessment as California and Colorado have had, but DEQ did conduct a local government needs assessment last summer. Well, really it ran from January of 2022 through July of 2023, but primarily was conducted through the middle of last year. This was essentially a request or a needs assessment of local government needs, so trying to understand what recycling infrastructure local governments needed, and it was essentially a statement of need by local governments as opposed to a sort of higher level gap assessment of the different gaps within Oregon's infrastructure. So like I said, Oregon does not have a formal pro approval process. Approval of CAA's program plan will be synonymous with approval of the organization. However, Oregon DEQ did ask prospective pros to submit letters of intent. Those were due by September of last year, and sort of kicked off a conversation amongst several potential pros that then culminated with CAA being the only pro submitting a program plan on April 1st of this year. Now that CAA's program plan is submitted, we have entered a program plan review and refinement process that will run this summer. In part, the program plan and the work that CAA is undertaking is addressing those local government needs that were stated in the needs assessment, and working towards addressing DEQ's revisions of CAA's program plan as we move through that process. We expect the program plan to be finally approved later in this year, and for program development to run through the first half of next year before that program starts July 1st of 2025. Next slide, please, Mark. Some of this might be the same, but there's a bit of a dial in here on where we're at in those processes at a high level that I just mapped out. So like I said, the initial program plan in Oregon was submitted on April 1st of this year. It was the only program plan submitted. Following submission of the program plan, CAA gave a presentation to the Oregon Recycling System Advisory Council, or ORSAC, on April 9th. This is the stakeholder advisory group that is participating in the development of the Recycling Modernization Act, or Oregon's EPR law. The Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, is required to solicit feedback from ORSAC and present the requested revisions to CAA by July 31st of 2024. We've already started to get some initial feedback from DEQ on the program plan. We fully expect that to be an iterative process, but this is the formal feedback that we'll be getting from the ORSAC on the program plan. CAA is expecting to submit a revised program plan in September of 2024, and then we anticipate that revised program plan will be approved sometime towards the end of 2024. I also mentioned that the Phase 2 rulemaking is currently underway. CAA has been participating in the Phase 2 rulemaking. We've been part of the Rulemaking Advisory Council, or Committee rather, in Oregon, as they deliberate on and discuss these Phase 2 rules. The formal comment period for the Phase 2 rules will begin at the end of May and run for a month. And then, like I said, those rules will be promulgated in November. In terms of important next steps, from a producer perspective, one of the key elements that was included in CAA's program plan was an outline of the 62 proposed reporting categories that CAA would like to see producers report their data to CAA in terms of. This is a really critical deliverable and a really critical element. These are the categories that producers will be sorting their packaging data into for reporting to CAA on an annual basis. To the best of our ability, we tried to map those 62 proposed categories in Oregon to the proposed 94 reporting categories that Cal Recycle has developed for California that would serve the same purpose there in terms of providing a backbone for producer reporting. In Oregon, we expect that those 62 reporting categories will be finally approved by Oregon DEQ by the end of July of this year. So that's a very near-term deliverable that we are anxious to make our way through so that we can start providing additional guidance to producers on reporting. CAA is continuing to work with DEQ to refine the program plan for resubmission in September. Like I said, that in part includes addressing those needs as expressed by local governments for the infrastructure that they need to see, along with a number of other data and planning exercises as we work through what will be an iterative process of reviewing and updating and revising that program plan. That is encapsulated at a larger scale in this system optimization project that will be sort of the conduit for revising the program plan and beginning, frankly, to start the early stages of implementing the program. And then the program in Oregon does start in July of 2025. So we have just over a year before that program launches, which is a very short amount of time. Next slide, please, Mark. Turning next to Colorado, In terms of updates since January, the needs assessment was completed and submitted to CAA on January 26th, which was just a week or two after our previous stakeholder update. Like I said, the medium recycling scenario was recommended by Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, was approved by the Joint Budget Committee on April 17th of this year. That's very exciting next step in the process, and now allows CAA to undertake the process of developing out a program plan for Colorado that meets the high-level goals and expectations of that medium recycling scenario. That projects a 52 to 58% recycling rate across all packaging materials by 2035. So that is the target goal, and the program plan will work to build out a system that will meet those projected rates. Like I said, rulemaking is also currently underway, and we expect that to conclude in late May, early June of this year, with that formal hearing occurring on May 21st of this year. In terms of next steps, obviously building out that program plan is going to be a large undertaking, and that's going to take up the bulk of the Colorado time and work over the next few months as we move towards that February 1st, 2025 submission deadline for that program plan. We are collecting additional data. We're having stakeholder conversations and bringing additional feedback in to inform program planning. And, you know, I mentioned that the 62 reporting categories in Oregon that we submitted with our program plan there are awaiting finalized approval by DEQ. Similarly, CAA will be submitting a proposed list of reporting categories for Colorado through the program plan. And those will then be part of the program plan approval process in Colorado. So we don't anticipate having finalized reporting categories in Colorado for a little bit longer. But given the near-term tight deadlines in Oregon around producer reporting, it's most critical that we have those finalized categories for Oregon. And we are expecting Colorado to promulgate their rules requiring, we are expecting Colorado to promulgate a rule requiring producer registration with CAA by October 1st of 2024. CAA has set our own registration deadline of July 1st of this year. Olivia will speak to that in a moment. But we expect Colorado to include this registration requirement within Colorado by October of this year. And then lastly, the program starts January 1st of 2026. Next slide, please, Mark. In California, again, a lot has been underway. The primary focus has been on the rules, and CalRecycle's formal comment period for their rules that closed on May 8th. CAA did submit rule comments, and on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit at a high level, although I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, at some of those rule comment areas that were priority areas for CAA. We anticipate that those rules will be promulgated by January 1st of 2025. And like I said, CalRecycle is already undertaking the release of RFPs for their needs assessment projects. We did submit comments on May 8th. Similar to Oregon, I mentioned that CalRecycle has developed out and released 94 draft categories for their reporting categories, or they call them covered material categories, or CMCs. This is where terminology across the states is important. Those reporting categories in California we expect to be finalized by July 1st of 2024. So following approval of California's reporting categories and Oregon's reporting categories, we're going to be able to start working in more depth with producers on all of the elements of producer reporting. And we've also been working with CalRecycle on the needs assessment. We've been consulting with the state as they develop out those RFPs, and per SB 54, the approved pro is required to work with the state through the needs assessment process. And that program will begin not on July 1st of 2025. Apologies for the mistype there on the slide. The program in California will start by January 1st of 2027. Next slide, please, Mark. So again, keeping an eye on the time here, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. We will be sharing these with all of you, as well as the recording after the fact. But did want to touch briefly on some of CAA's priority rule comments that went in. There's been a lot of interest in the SB 54 rulemaking process in general, but also interest in knowing sort of the things that CAA has top of mind as we move through that process. First and foremost, on reporting and registration, it is critical that CAA have producers registered with the organization well in advance of the launch of the program. And that's for a number of reasons. First and foremost, we need producers to be preparing for and developing out their internal data management, and that is in service of CAA collecting that data and making sure that we're able to accurately develop out our budget and accurately develop out fee schedules so that producers are paying their fair way through the program. We have set a July 1st, 2024 registration deadline. However, we're also looking to the states to backstop that registration with their own dates. As such, we've asked for a backstop registration deadline in California, and the earliest we believe that CalRecycle is likely able to create an enforceable backstop would be April 1st of next year. So this doesn't change CAA's July 1st, 2024 registration deadline, but we are looking to the state to back that up with a state enforceable registration deadline of the Q2 of next year. In terms of the definition of obligated producer, all of our comments around the definition of obligated producer are in service of making sure that we have crystal clear definitions. This is critical so that we make sure that for every piece of covered material supplied into a given state, there is only one obligated entity. A really important element of this was making sure that the definition of in the state, as used in the definition of obligated producer in CalRecycle's rules, they had originally clarified through or proposed a rule that would require the state to look to jurisdiction of California courts as the basis for whether or not a producer was based in the state. And CAA has concerns that that could potentially obligate any producer around the world, provided that they could be served by California courts. More importantly, the only litmus test for determining whether an entity is actually subject to California courts is, in fact, a court case, which is not a very workable, functional approach for determining whether or not there is an obligation. So CAA has made a recommendation that CalRecycle instead look to the Secretary of State's business database. In terms of source reduction, this is a key element of SB 54. The statute requires that CalRecycle set a 2023 baseline of all of the plastic packaging that is supplied into California, against which the 25% source reduction target that must be achieved by producers by 2032 is measured against. The state is currently developing out their needs assessment study that will develop out that baseline. And CAA has requested through the rules that some flexibility be developed here in terms of the data that CalRecycle looks to. We want that baseline to be as accurate as possible. We think everyone should want that baseline to be as accurate as possible so that that source reduction is based against a real baseline that is in fact reflective of the amount of packaging that is supplied into California. And as such, since producers won't be reporting to CAA until at least 2025, we are asking the state to look to the producer data supplied in 2025 as the basis for that baseline, or at least to inform that 2023 baseline. We also commented to the state asking that they ensure that the scope of obligated materials aligns with the scope of the recycling system funding. This is really critical, making sure that there's alignment between the materials that are paying fees and the materials that are collected and managed through the program. And last but not least, we also had several comments to CalRecycle about cost coverage and funding mechanism. We asked that there be clarification from the state around the scope of funding. SB 54 seems to imply that the the producer funding should only apply to new eligible costs in the system, not to the full cost coverage of existing and new costs. And so we asked for clarification and encouraged CalRecycle to limit the program to eligible new costs in the system, to build out and improve California's recycling system above and beyond where it's currently at. With that and an eye on the time, I'm going to pass it back to Olivia to take us through a quick overview of producer registration and preparedness, and then we'll jump into some of your questions.
Great. If we could skip ahead a couple slides here, Mark. There we go. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I've been looking at the questions in the Q&A, and I actually think that some of the ones that have come in most recently will hopefully be addressed by this content, but we'll go back to some of those too in our remaining minutes here and move through this as quickly as we possibly can. So John has touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth underscoring before we get into these state-specific deadlines. I want to again reiterate why CAA is seeking producer registrations by July 1st of this year. In the absence of statutory deadlines, and even where some states like Colorado and Oregon are in the process of proposing deadlines through rules, as John mentioned. While some of these program start dates feel far away, certainly not Oregon's, there is a tremendous amount of work that has to go into ensuring that the pro and producers by extension are compliant with the laws. So we need producer data to develop program plans that have accurate and informed fees. We cannot, the fee rates are really going to depend on our understanding of the number of producers in the system and what they are putting into the system. And one of the reasons why this is really important to you, if you are a producer, is we know that you're getting a lot of questions internally related to what is this going to cost? How can we be preparing? How can we be budgeting? So it's really important that you and your peers register with us sooner rather than later, because that does two things. That enables us to start providing more detailed guidance and support to help you prepare for reporting and those reporting requirements to the PRO, which we know will be a time-consuming process that requires coordination across a number of functions within your organizations. But again, it means that then once we have done that preparation, we've got data flowing in that is going to help support fee accuracy so that the numbers that you are giving your finance teams start to look a little bit more accurate. So again, I just wanted to underscore why that is important and why that is important to an individual company as well. So what you see here is that the earliest deadlines are in Oregon. And so of course our first objective is now to help producers prepare for reporting in this state. However, there's no reporting deadline in law, but there is the program start date of next year. Again, this is where we come back to our July 1st date, and that being really critical so that we are not trying to start a program, release fees, and invoice for fees all on the same day that the program starts. And that's one of the reasons that we've come up with these very preliminary draft deadlines for producer reporting. Again, I would say preliminary draft, this is all evolving as we see the proposed rules, as we get clarity through discussions with the state and through some of those rulemaking processes. But again, for Oregon, as an example, we are expecting, if we can get producers to register by this July, that will get us in a great position to be able to do some education and release a guidebook with more detailed information on how producers should be parsing their data and preparing to report for Oregon specifically in the second half of this year. And then that will hopefully prepare you for data reporting in the first quarter of next year. There was a question in the chat that I want to acknowledge here, as it sort of speaks to how we've categorized the information on this slide, but we haven't put here exactly what the invoicing dates are and payment terms and all those things that are still getting worked out internally. But we have noted here that producer fee obligations begin on specific dates, and those dates are essentially the program start dates. So important for people to understand here that your fee obligations will start in July of next year for Oregon. Just a little caveat on Oregon with the fee schedule that we've been talking about, and I think, we noted that in the Oregon program plan, we do have some fee estimates across a limited, sort of a broader group of categories. Those are, again, not informed by producer data or comprehensive producer data. So the sooner we can get data in, the more accurate we can get those. We will have updated fee rates in the plan that we resubmit, assuming that our first plan is sort of a first iteration and doesn't get approved by Oregon DEQ. There will be updated rates in September, and then probably those official fee schedules released in June, just before the program start. I'm not going to go through every state here, but again, just want to, we'll share these slides. I would say, again, some of these internal deadlines are a bit of a moving target, but this is really what we came up with to back into what you need and what we need in terms of data preparation and reporting. Again, you can see that we've got different program start dates here, but a lot that needs to happen before those programs go into effect. And as John explained, we've been making that case to agencies like CalRecycle through our rulemaking comments. We need to ensure that producers and the pro can comply with the various requirements of the law, some of which need to happen before that program start date in January 2027. And we won't be able to do that if everyone is waiting until the night before January 1st to register with CAA. We will not be able to deliver the program plan. All right, let's move to the next slide, because I want to look back at questions before we conclude here as well. So we've reinforced now this producer registration deadline. I think we've spoken to the reasons why it's important. I won't belabor the point on accurate fees. I think, the more producers that we get registered and the closer we get to having that entire universe of producers registered, the less likely it is that those who are registered will be paying for packaging that is not theirs, i.e. subsidizing the cost of for those who aren't registered. We refer to those companies as free riders. So again, really important to start this process early and minimize the presence of free riders in the system. The registration process is very simple. You can scan this QR code. You can go to the link here. This link is, you may not be able to click through Zoom. I can't remember which of the video conference platforms allow that on screen. But this is all accessible in the producer resources section of our website. Producer registration right now is simply the provision of your company's name, a selection of which of the 3 states that we've been talking about today, if not all, you would expect to be a producer for, and then provide a primary contact. And again, this does not have to be the person who is officially responsible for EPR compliance within your company for all eternity. We know that there's a lot of internal conversations happening right now as to who should own this responsibility. I've seen companies sort of set up cross-functional project teams, and maybe you have a project manager who can be the primary contact for now, but that person's going to have to work with other people internally to as these various requirements come due. So that person might be working with legal when we get to a point past this simple registration process, post July 1st, where we're starting to send out participant agreements, so the legal agreements that companies need to sign to participate in CAA and meet their obligations under EPR laws. So and then you would likely bring in other people for data reporting. So again, we recognize that there are a lot of internal teams that are impacted by these programs. Right now, we're looking for someone who knows to look out for emails from CAA and has the ability to loop in the right people to ensure that deadlines are not missed, and that you're also getting all of the information about opportunities to engage with the organization and support your regulatory planning and compliance efforts. Next slide, please. How are we doing that? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I want to look at the questions. We're doing it through our stakeholder webinars. We have producer working group. That is a 90-minute monthly meeting in which we go into a lot more detail than we shared today, if you can believe it. and are, taking questions and feedback on some of the things that we are proposing to the state agencies, different elements of our program planning processes. These are opportunities where producers can hear more about what's going on, and also get more detailed guidance and information to prepare to meet their obligations. Those sessions have been available to those who have sort of made a claim that, unofficially, that they expect to be a producer under these laws, and moving forward starting in June to create a bit of an incentive for our July 1st registration date. We will limit access to those producer working group sessions to registered producers. We will, however, continue to have weekly onboarding sessions for that. This is a new thing that we're doing. It's, I think, just an hour every week, where it's a very brief, very high level sort of EPR 101 presentation, followed by open Q&A with us for producers that are still trying to figure things out. So we're not going dark on you, but we are, there's a lot of value that from those producer working group sessions that those who are making their plans for implementation and compliance with these laws will want to be a part of. And that's, again, another reason why registration will be by July 1st is really important. Next slide, please. Great. I think this has been mentioned a couple times, but we appreciate that and I see a lot of questions in the chat around what can I do now? What am I supposed to do with these reporting categories? I think directionally, if you're looking for some next steps, looking at those categories and trying to map your packaging portfolio to them is a good step. We don't anticipate that those reporting categories, or covered material categories as they're called in California, are going to change radically. We may be able to sort of share links to those either in follow-up or in the chat here. But once those have been finalized, we will be able to finalize a producer guidebook that we've been working on. Our goal is to distribute that end of summer, early fall, and that is really going to provide a lot more granularity on what you need to do to prepare to report for Oregon specifically, and there will be some considerations for other states, California in particular. But really oriented around getting everyone ready to report their data for Oregon in Q1 of next year. So more to come there. And again, that'll be, that important to register so that you've got access to all of those materials, and then the sort of education sessions that will support it. Next slide, please. Great. I think we should go to questions. I'm going to ask you to start us off, John, as I haven't been looking at them as I've been talking here, but I'll keep monitoring as we go here. And again, I know we're low on time. This was a lot of content today, so we'll continue to use the questions you've submitted to update our frequently asked questions on our website.